Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Tuesday topic. Today's topic is same story, different generation, each one reach one in higher education. And now I am going to throw it over to Rachel DeLauder, who is our host and moderator for today, to introduce both her and her panel. So Rachel, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. My name is Rachel DeLauder, and I am a current graduate of the College of Nursing and Health Professions in the Master's Program in Dance Movement Therapy at Drexel. And here with me today are current graduate and professional staff and professor who are both in the field of music therapy and alumni of the program. We have Dr. Marisol Norris and Alwayne Spencer. But before we begin, a few housekeeping items I would like to keep in mind. As a moderator, I will guide the panelists and myself through questions for today's discussion. For each question, each person has 3 to 4 minutes for each question per panelist, but if our conversation starts to stimulate more questions and dialogue between the panelists and myself, audience, please know that this will exceed over the 8-minute time mark for the Q&A. But as audience members, please know to drop your question in the chat so we can address later on the Q&A if time permits. And afterwards, please stay tuned for the recorded extended version that will be posted on the CNHP YouTube page, I believe in a couple of days, on the extended version of Same Stories, Different Generations, Each One Reach One Towards Higher Education, that will showcase excerpts from current faculty, staff, and students and alumni of CNHP. Now that we have only a short time period, only an hour, and I would really like to get started, I would like to first introduce the African proverb and the inspiration of Each One Reach One, which is saying each one teaches one, is an African proverb that originated in America during chattel slavery before 1868. And Africans enslaved were denied an education, and it was illegal to read and write. So when one learned to read or write, it became one's duty to teach their own. Now, as introducing the courageous conversation and building upon same stories, different generations, barriers to students to higher education from the previous panel that was hosted in fall 2020, this panel will now introduce new voices to share their experiences as marginalized and minoritized students navigating CNHP towards graduation. Participants will engage with the graduate student and professor for illustrations of potential overlaps and navigation strategies, along with current tools in leadership, advocacy, and practice. The empowerment of Each One Reaches One centers on education, classroom for professional career success. This forum is essential for faculty, professional staff, and students to learn together to improve our classroom interactions and avoid past mistakes. Now I will introduce the panelists. We now have Ms. Dr. Marisol Norris. She is an assistant clinical professor and director of music therapy in the Creative Arts Therapy Department. Her music therapy practice and supervisory experience has spanned from medical and community health settings and include music therapy with adolescents experiencing house insecurity, adults with psychiatric and dual diagnoses, and families within the city court systems, and medically fragile children. She is also the founder of Black Music Therapy Network, Inc., a core organizing member of the Critical Pedagogies and Arts Therapies Alliance, and the co-creator of the Journal of Music Therapy Justice, and also equity research mentorship programs. And she's also the co-founder of the Black Arts Therapies Educators, as well as a part of the Biopic Student Fund. She is presented nationally and internationally on radical practice and frameworks and critical topics in arts therapies and education. Please look forward and stay tuned to her 2021 release on her first co-editing book, Post-Colonialism and Music Therapy, Beginning Dialogues. Welcome, Dr. Norris. We next have Mr. Alwayne Spencer. He is a current graduate and alumnus of the Music Therapy Master's Program in the Creative Arts Therapy Department. He has completed his clinical internship at the 11th Street Family Health Services, where he's a vocal psychotherapy experience and developed his own vocal psychotherapy experience and helped develop a unique approach in music therapy in community settings. He has served as an executive board member of the Cats for Color with the Creative Arts Therapy Department. He's creating civic engagement in higher education, curriculum auditing, and strategy and CAT department accountability. In addition, he is also a CEO and owns his own business entitled AWELC Business, and also a music instructor and recording artist who seeks to challenge the everlasting industry with music therapy principles while impacting those who have influenced cultures around the world. Please stay tuned and look forward to him currently in the midst of writing a grant proposal for an external program proposal. And he also looks forward to creating more opportunities for Black men to receive services in the music therapy field. Now, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Marisol Norris and Alwayne Spencer. I will now get started with the first question. Panelists, as we get started, after I read each question, since all of us are going to be unmuted, one person can raise their hand or they can also come off mute so we can respond to a question so there's no potential overlap between questions. So now we get started. Please, panelists, can you reflect upon your experience when you were a student here at Drexel University?
So as I reflect on my experience at Drexel University, it was one that was filled with a lot of learning and also a lot of unlearning as well. I found myself in a constant space of advocacy, as well as learning from those around me, my peers. But then I also found my niche in music therapy in some way. And I think one of the beautiful things about learning at Drexel is that you get like a holistic experience. And so when you're surrounded by people who have different experiences, different lived experiences, as myself, I was able to actually grapple with some of the things that I came in with and leave with the solution and leave with something that was tangible and leave with more of a solution-oriented approach when dealing with clients who may look like myself, as well as those who may not have the same lived experiences as myself.
And so I'll follow up here. And before I even start, I just want to say thank you for having us and creating this space, Rachel. I think it's so important, as you mentioned, it's an important forum for peoples of color to share their experiences, but so much for our movement building as well. How we navigate these spaces is critically important. So I'm very happy to be here along with Alwayne as well. So for me, I actually went through the Drexel education twice. I was in my master's program. I started off my master's program. I just completed my bachelor's in HBCU, Oakwood University, with music and psychology and vocal pedagogy. And I really wanted to look at how music was really a catalyst for healing and transformation. So I joined the music therapy program as a student for my master's program and really delved into what it meant to be a clinician and practitioner. After I graduated, I went on and went into that field, into the professional world, and started practicing, but then I had a lot of different questions, right? And so, Al, when you talked about learning and unlearning, and I love that you used both of those concepts, because there was a point of unlearning that had to take place within professional practice as well, especially when we wanted to look at power and how power played out in different spaces. So I returned back to Drexel to answer a lot of the questions that I had around power, particularly around ideas of Blackness, how that was seen within a therapeutic sphere, especially when you're thinking about music and how it may manifest in different spaces, the types of associations people place onto music. And so I returned back for the second time to really answer some of those questions. And while there are different goals for a master's degree as well as a professional doctorate degree, right? There were some crossovers, there's some through lines in those experiences that I think are actually quite critical to our conversation today, because a part of that was learning, what it means to be not just a Black student within those spaces, or not just the practice of our profession in these very spaces, and then theoretical, creation and research in doctoral spaces. It's really kind of thinking about what does it mean to be a minoritized therapist across my profession. And so there was a learning of how to navigate those spaces, and an unlearning of returning back to some of the communal work, some of the community grounded work that was necessary too when I came back the second time.
I would like to piggyback off of those crossovers and through lines you mentioned in clinical practice, and you talked about within music therapy specifically. Within your clinical internship experience, could you please highlight what some of those crossovers were in terms of communities that you were serving, and also what you were learning in terms of your curriculum here at Drexel University?
Yeah, so for me, what I was really navigating was this idea of freedom. All right, so when we think about music and we think about improvisation, at the crux of it, you're thinking about how do people use music as an instrument or a catalyst of engaging spaces that could yield aspects of freedom and liberation, right? And so for me, what was transforming or transpiring rather in some of the clinical spaces that I was navigating was these ideas that to create, to transform, to play in sometimes inherently what I would conceive as Black music was something that was inherently liberating and freeing. And so watching clients of all different races have to come in contact with those different ideas, right? And think about what kinds of access does Black music afford to be able to experience this type of freedom? You know, how those different conversations would shift based upon different topics such as appropriation or thinking about privileges and navigating privilege, or ideas of homeland and what does home mean, and then different types of political conversations around place. What place do we have, and what space can we exhibit as our own? So these ideas of ownership, right? So there were these different things that were linked to some of the therapeutic methods and skills that I was learning in the classroom, that when it came into a space with people, right, then the people transformed that space and we brought about new conversations that you needed to give a critical ear to, because it created a new frame in which you would understand the work that you were doing.
Yes, I'll even piggyback on that. As I relate to my clinical experience at 11th Street, I was very vocal therapy heavy. And so, excuse me, I reflect on how music was an access point to clients being able to further explore their identity, and how I remember having a particular client who was struggling with anxiety and also identity, and how certain developmental stages were being present when we use music to explore one's identity. If someone were to ask you who you are, what would that sound like on the drums? And that was just a particular question that I kind of just threw out there with the client. And to see the various stages take place during that particular session was very striking and very eye-opening, because music actually can bring forth different developmental stages at any particular point within the session itself. And so I think for me, as I reflect on my overall experience at 11th Street, it was really about self-exploration, self-identity, self-concept, and really having a sense of knowing who you are as an individual, regardless of your background, and how music plays a part in that, and also helping aid in really like solutions to what is being presented in that moment.
I see a lot of through lines, of course, between the unlearning and de-learning happens, and also reaffirming your identity, not just even as a professional, clinician, and student, but I think just a person in general. And as you are a student, you're still navigating that through the halls of CNHP and also within your classrooms. I really am very intrigued to want to know, just as both past and current students, what challenges were experienced during your time as a student, as we highlight in your clinical settings, but I think also just in classroom settings as well. What were some of the experiences during your time as a student?
So some challenges that I can think about is, for one, stating the obvious, being the only Black man in the program, the 3 creative arts therapies programs combined, but then also being the only person from the Black diaspora standpoint in the classroom within the music therapy space, in the music therapy classroom. But then also, I thought about just challenges with certain music that were used and utilized throughout the curriculum, at least in the earlier part of it, and how there was a sense of, and I'll go back to the unlearning part of it, and understanding that every music has a purpose in music therapy, and though it may not necessarily be my preference, it is still purposeful in a clinical setting. And so that's one thing that I reflect on as it relates to like the challenge that I've had to kind of sort through as it relates to my learning in the classroom.
Yeah, and I think for me, there are, well, for me, I was one of 2 in the music therapy program. And at the time we had 2 Black students that were music therapists. You had 2 Black students that were art therapists and 2 Black that were dance movement therapists. And so we came up with the idea of the token 2 because it seemed like that was the language that we used to be able to frame what our experience was. Because we looked back in classes behind us and there were 2 Black students there as well. So we were like, could we not hold more than just the 2 of us in this class space? And what kind of meaning we derived from that? It was important. But beyond this idea of lack of diversity within the class composition, which I think is very important, there was also a lack of representation within the literature, right? And that has its own set of has its own set of meaning, right? So it wasn't necessarily just that there was lack of representation in literature. It was an idea that there was some invisibility in our experience, right? So there was a lack of understanding of how race and how different aspects of our identity were integral to our knowing and our learning. So what became commonplace and what became part of our understanding was that to matriculate through the profession was to subjugate yourself to your own erasure, right? So it was important for us to be able to create spaces, and that's exactly what we did. We created spaces as minority students to create place for us. That's a womanist strategy within Black community, placemaking. That's part of our active world making. To come together and try to make sense and meaning of what's taking place around us, and then strategize on how to connect with others. For us, thankfully, there might not have been Black professors in the music therapy program or the creative arts therapy program. We sought out those students from different programs, or we sought out students that had graduated before us, or we sought out faculty members of different programs. That's how we kind of made it through. So it's the same proverb of how to understand and navigate those spaces and learn that and pass it on. But I think part of the challenges that we had in those classrooms, in this one idea of representation, is that we didn't really learn about those significant I can't even put a name to what they are. I think about those path makers within our field that would have opened up our understanding, of ourselves and our sense of belonging within the profession. So Fran Goldberg, and how Fran created these different spaces around music psychotherapy, and being one of the first in the US to use that term that then became something that was so much bigger within our profession, or ideas around, Richard Graham, who created, who helped to build the bridge between the two different music therapy associations that now is the AMTA, the American Music Therapy Association, like their significant work, or community music therapy, which is now a big trend in 2021, but it was first spoke about by Zane Raglan in 1974. So it's like, if without those different understandings, those mappings of our genealogy, there's a lack of place that we can kind of use as a springboard to not just understanding ourselves, but bridges to our communities, right? And then also bridges back to ourselves in different ways. And I think that was a major concern that we had. And beyond that, I think that there are ways in which culturally sustaining practice gets subverted in the midst of that, right? So we're not looking at how a framework is sociopolitically grounded, then you can't necessarily make connections to the various contexts that you work and you engage in. So that kind of exorcism of race, exorcism of spirituality, exorcism of all these different social identifiers then moved us in a way that we could not necessarily integrate various social contexts and have a larger repertoire of practice when we're thinking about how to serve our clients in ways that would be most effective to them in that point in time. It's really linked to clinical decision making in its broadest and simplest term. Like, if you're not able to connect those pieces, it's all connected, then you're not able to make those different connections in other spaces. And so I think that would have that being maybe the crux of it all, the erasure of those identities, then also led to different types of erasures that need to be repaired.
Thank you, Dr. Norris. Thank you. I don't know how to follow up with that, but I really would like to follow up with another question, and just specifically, because you mentioned in relating to your clients and people that you're serving, especially people of color as well, and in these spaces and in these communities that need help serving. Do you feel like when you were trying to practice within the curriculum that was being taught, did you feel like there was a significant disconnect versus when you were implementing your own pedagogy, I would say, and your own strategy that really came from the heart and your creativity, from your own framework that you've learned throughout your upbringing, throughout in the Black diaspora, as a representative of the Black diaspora, as someone who identifies as someone in the Black diaspora?
Yeah, I think that there was a huge disconnect. And I think what's important to also note is that as a student, I didn't know exactly what questions I needed to ask, right? So I didn't know, I knew I was longing for something. I knew that there were issues. I knew I couldn't necessarily read myself across the page. I knew I couldn't necessarily make connections between myself and my Black clients. I knew I couldn't make connections between myself and sometimes my white clients. I knew that there was a huge lack in our training that needed to be compensated in different ways. So that was evident, and I think that it took, and it's still, and I'll be honest, it's still, considering that those frameworks have not changed, and it's taken a lot of work from a lot of minoritized therapists to bring together these different ideas and be more substantiated in the frameworks and in sharing of these frameworks, disseminating these frameworks in ways that would build lenses within our communities. I think that there's sometimes still areas where I'm like, goodness, I wish I had that. I had to read. I had to go and do some digging. I remember for my doctoral work, I think I was at such a loss, not knowing exactly where to turn within my profession. I decided to go to University of Penn and did Africana Studies for a year, so that I can at least have a grounding, have some kind of space where I can claim and see if some of the ideas that I was working with had a place to live and breathe, and then came back and started integrating things with other professionals in the field of psychology and the field of in different spaces to make sense of it. So definitely there was a disconnect, and I wouldn't necessarily say I was working in deficit per se, because I believe that there are other areas that bolstered that experience, and there was other ways in which my lens offered new ways of exploring my work. But at the same time, I knew that there was there was an area of lack within the training that could have been fortified if there was at least an acknowledgement that race was a pivotal construct in which we're all navigating day to day.
Thank you. So, of course, when we talked about reflection and dialogue and action to address our role in perpetuating these injustices and formulating strategies, we try to prevent them. And so as past and current students and current professors, well, in the proverb, as we talk about each one teaching one, how are your roles involved in empowering marginalized and minoritized students of color, specifically within Drexel, and also I would say beyond, as well as students that you've impacted within your careers?
Yes, I can directly speak to that. As a founding member and vice president of Cats of Color, for the time that I was serving there, I definitely think that the forefront of my involvement with the group, as it relates to the CAT department, was advocacy, and being able to be the bridge or the liaison between students within the classroom who experienced some level of microaggression or harm in some way in academia, and being able to hold the department accountable for some of the things that were that occurred, and sometimes it was, not necessarily aware that these things happened, but because these things sat differently with students of color who were marginalized and who continue to be marginalized outside of the Drexel system. It was always great to have a community of people that their voices can be heard, and then also come up with tactful strategies to prevent those things from happening again in the classroom. And then also, even moving into the clinical work, being able to advocate for clients when needed. For instance, having medicine and troubles with medicine, or someone not being responded to right away, there was always a tactical strategy that I would use to get involved with my supervisor, talk to my supervisor and say, hey, this is something that is happening. What can we do about it? And being able to just be an agent of change, even in that realm, to ensure that people are getting what they need.
And then for me, I think that one of the main ways in which I'm able to kind of navigate, and my role has shifted as an educator, is one, building frameworks that can support the learning and engagement of students, so that they're able to explore the various aspects of themselves, but also build up these different constructs that really allow for relational thinking, right? That connects them to themselves, to others, to societies, and being able to make those critical clinical decisions as well. To support that, a lot of that also lands in being an advocate and a bridge, as Alwayne has already noticed. But it changes and it shifts context as you move into this kind of professional space. And so a lot of times that is recognizing continuums of harm in these different spaces, in the classroom spaces, at the university, college, and university level. I think it's important that we acknowledge continuums of harm. Also recognizing how within the educator's role now you hold a different responsibility, not just to call for accountability, but to also move and work towards the accountability that's needed in those different spaces. And so there is an extra emphasis in acknowledging the harms that take place, and acknowledging the count and placing your hand into the work of the accountability. And I think the other piece that I think is really important, especially now as we see more and more of our students advocating for themselves and speaking for their own the things that they've seen, sharing their stories, telling their experiences, and asking for that accountability, is that we recognize them as agents within our society, and we link those levels of agency to various aspects of their work. So that's not something that's solely to be repaired, but it's something to be celebrated, that our students in general, they're able to see an area that needs to be changed, make a strategic plan and action, and go about that change, right? That's something that we want to see when we go into clinical spaces and healthcare spaces, right? We want to be able to say that we're able to advocate for our clients. So changing and reframing that narrative of advocacy and movement building amongst students as something that should be addressed and repaired, or quickly targeted and fixed, as actually something that's an ongoing developmental process for all healthcare providers, in which they start to understand how it is to advocate, what does it mean to advocate, and what are the most effective strategies in advocacy. So I think that that's something that needs to be upheld, and a shift in our frame too, that I think as an educator, there's a responsibility to hold.
Thank you. I see with advocacy and mobilization, also the empowerment piece. I really would like for you to reflect upon, if you had your druthers, how can academic institutions better support marginalized and minoritized students of color? And when we talk about advocacy and increasing that mobilization and also creating those strategies, were there something specifically within those strategies that you would like to reflect upon when you were a student, and also as a current professor and educator as well?
Well, right now I'm just pondering on the question.
Okay, so I could take it. And actually, I recently wrote, co-edited a journal, a special issue for Voices, a music therapy journal that kind of explores Black aesthetics largely. And so I'm actually taking some of the points that students and co-editors and co-authors have also spoken, and to kind of bring it into this space and amplify those things that have already been said in many ways. But I think that there's a responsibility for our institutions to really recognize and sustain those genealogies, those maps that we talked about before, of those that BIPOC and minoritized members of our community that have actually started creating pathways for our transformation and for our liberation when we think about justice in the work, and justice in health, whether it be health equity, whatever elements of that. I think it's important that we restore interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary commitments by collaborating with practitioners and thinkers that are stretching the ways in which we understand ourselves and our work. Oftentimes that is partnerships with communities, partnership with in settings that may not be part of the typical academic hierarchy. I think those breaking down those hierarchies is really important, because it also kind of dismantles these paradigms of othering, right? And so then again, reestablishing these collaboratives when we think about research, when we think about writing, when we think about professional development, I think that all those different things are important. Prioritizing the well-being of BIPOC students is important. And not only students, but professionals and faculty as well, by eliminating those structural barriers that interfere with our ability to fully take in our academic spaces, that fully allows us to navigate our professional working spaces. I think the ways in which we look at bias is one element of that, but I think that there are so many more structural elements that we can really interrogate and critically look at that can actually further support our abilities to not only thrive in these spaces, but completely excel in the spaces as we already have, right? So like just kind of notch it up, bring it up even another notch. Join different networks. I think it's important for universities to really think about how does the university function as a colonial arm, right? And how does it function from the same kind of white supremacist patriarchal kind of lens and gaze and think about the histories of that, right? So I think that there needs to be some truth telling within university spaces and some acknowledging. And then I always think about this in general when we think about when we have these conversations about justice and race, like what are we willing to give back, right? What are we willing to lose, and what are and how do you show your commitment to those spaces? Like, is it something that's only in word? Is it only in action interpersonally, or are there bigger ways in which you can show that you're committed to these types of struggles? And is it just as a point of service and a one-time thing, or is it something that's continual? And I think that there are ways in which we can really support the initiatives that are already taking place on the ground, right? So the diversity and equity, Dr. Veronica Carey is here, and they're doing wonderful work in creating spaces and transforming the ways in which we understand diversity, equity, and inclusion as just one throughway to the work that we're doing. Like, what happens if we were able to even transform those paradigms moving forward? If those commitments were so strong and so sure to those different ideals, that we transform even these ideas of inclusion, so that there would be an increased critical engagement in this work. So I think that there's ways in which we support the things that are happening now, that are taking place now, and they're already on the ground. And then we also amplify those voices that have been doing this work and can collectively do the work. Allow that critical mass to grow and make sure that we don't limit those structural barriers that would reduce their work.
Yes, I would even say, because I just had a thought that advocacy can be a lifelong commitment. And then it's a lifelong commitment that is fruitful, but I think it's a thankless job in such a way that sometimes it can be tiring. And something that you were mentioning in your question about even as a professional staff member, faculty, or a student, I often think about students who are advocating themselves that I've seen throughout my year at my 2 years at Drexel, how cast of color were very persistent in advocacy in our work and engagement. But I also wonder, from a professional, as my is actually shifting as well, who is advocating for professional staff when they do get tired and when they do get weary and when the work gets burdensome. And I think something that could be worked on is just the advocacy on in that piece as well, of like advocacy for self-care for those who are working tirelessly behind the scenes, making sure that the curriculum is strong in social justice, because the work does get tiring and it does get burdensome. I experienced it as a student, so I can only imagine how much more it is burdensome for professional staff. And then also, in tandem with that, I was thinking about just ways in which that can be a collaboration between students and faculty as well, and working together to make sure that it's burdensome, that there is tactical tools in place to ensure that students who are advocating for themselves or constantly finding themselves in that space of advocacy are getting the proper resources that they need to continue to push forward. And I often say that if we have healthier teachers, we'll have a healthier student body. Your student body have a healthier generation.
I love that.
Kind of like move forward into the professional realm of music therapy.
I love that. I also believe that as to form those liaisons within students and professors and faculty members, it takes I say it takes a village really to really help students out, and especially in terms of in their professional careers, but also for professors are also learning too as well. And of course, pedagogies change, but the history is still there, but that needs to be taught. And the invisibility that you talk about, not even just within your culture as well, but also yourself. You feel you're trying to serve your community, but it's like, how can you serve your community when you're also trying to service yourself too as well. And self-care and your care is very, very important. I know Dr. Carey talked about some students feeling that loneliness, but also feeling they have to go through pain and to be in pain, specifically as a student in order to get through the program. But it's not just about getting through the program. It's also really about getting those resources and being successful, but it's really what does that success look like for that student? And it really takes, I say, that village to really help to advocate and to navigate for that student in these spaces. I believe we do have some time for Q&A. If someone would like to drop in the chat box, and I will read the question out, and I will have the panelists, if they would like to answer the question. If there's anyone that would like to ask a question for the panelists for the webinar today.
Yeah, I'll jump in for just a second. So first of all, this has been phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And Rachel, thank you so much again, as Dr. Norris noted, for coming up with this concept and encouraging this kind of conversation. And yes, that platform that I've been standing on for a couple of years now truly is that students do not have to be in pain to get a degree. And unfortunately, a lot of students of color are acculturated to get in and get out, and do not make waves in the middle. Mom and dad are working 2 and 3 jobs to get you there. If you have a microaggression, deal with it. If the macroaggression, maybe bring it home and sort it out, right? And go back and face it the next week. And then by the time a person graduates, becomes an alumni, then I hear, this is what I endured when I was there. So we have to create spaces for which students can voice now. It's imperative. I was taking copious notes, as I always do whenever we have these sessions. And for you guys to talk about ownership and space and home and transformation solutions, class compositions, curriculum, literature, representation, visibility, you see I was paying attention, harm reduction, the erasure, the subjugation, making space, making it through, connections of social identifiers, making voices heard, tactile strategies, advocacy, and bridging. Yes, all of these things will and need to transpire so that we don't have students thinking and believing that pain is synonymous with getting, whether it be undergraduate or graduate degree. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation. I'm glad for the 17 sets of ears that are hearing this conversation, because maybe then we can become the change agents to start talking about it with our respective groups about how can we make these changes happen. So while some of you might, go ahead. I see you warning.
Jump in, because I think that there's another piece that we don't always talk about in this point of advocacy, because this idea that you bring up, and Dr. Carey, thank you for just listing and bringing it all together here again. It makes me think about tools of dehumanization, right? So there are different tools of dehumanization that can be utilized that reinforces this pain and then reinforces this idea that you're all by yourself making it work. And I think at times there are ways in which minority students are often tokenized in these spaces, even in our advocacy spaces, in ways that further separates us from our communities and reinforces these different narratives. And so it's always interesting to me that, there have always been a group of people before you and before us, that there was one before me, groups that are paving ways and creating these spaces. And oftentimes our diversity officers, VPs of diversity, various members, minority faculty are story holders, right? So they hold those stories that allow us to kind of continue moving. And so I think that it's also important to think about how to connect ourselves and how we create spaces to fortify these connections outside of the university, so that there are clear through lines back to our communities. So, what does it mean that once I leave this space, once I leave these academic walls, and I've given and I have worked, if I wasn't an educator, would I still be actively involved in Drexel in the building? I say yes, because I'm doing movement building in different spaces. But being able to say, there is a group of people outside of yourself that is actively doing this work. And then making those types of connections is also important, because if we don't do that thing, then it reinforces this narrative that you're alone in this process and you are going to save us, which is another type of colonial narrative, right? That you as one group or one person has to do the saving of us all. And so I think we really need to kind of dissect those different ideas of dehumanization as well, and really build those bridges back to the various resources that are established in these spaces. And I think about music here again, right? Music, it's so interesting when I think about Black communities, how we've survived so much and how we've made it through so much. And when we stop and we come back to music therapy curriculum and we start understanding what, for me, I can speak of myself, start understanding how music is functioning in therapeutic spaces, all of a sudden it dawns on me, goodness, we've been utilizing the music in these different ways all this time that allowed us to move through so much pain. And it's like, how do we shore up our resources and recognize how these things are taking place in so many aspects of our work, so that we can build these bridges that are not injustice to even the word bridges, that are, build pipelines that are not injustice to the ideas of pipelines, but these kind of very complex networks to make sure that we have what we need as we're moving forward.
And I think what both you, Dr. Norris, and Alwayne also raised is that oftentimes the persons who are subjugated and erased are the ones that are asked to fix it. So thank goodness that we're beginning affinity groups, right? We're having other advocacy conversations. We're having the conversations like this that'll go up on to the Drexel YouTube so others can be encouraged to watch it. Maybe they didn't feel comfortable to be present today, but they'll watch it at their own space and maybe making changes, because these are the markers that we need to be able to say on this date, this transpired. As I always say, similar to the title of this opportunity today, each one, reach one is mine, right? Each one, teach one, I think is also today. So even when we have events, I'm always saying, okay, so Rachel, you're coming, you need to bring someone too. So each one, reach one is the only way we're going to get a lot of these conversations happening, and getting these numbers that are going to be exponentially larger, because more people are going to feel comfortable, not stigmatized, no reproach, that can come and say, I'm unsure, I don't know how to move my feet. It's okay, you don't know how to move your feet. You're here to understand maybe what we endure because you don't move your feet or have no sense of how to go about doing it. So, and the music part, it's so funny because we just celebrated my grandson's first birthday over the weekend. And when he even looked like he was about to break out in tears, we all start singing to him, right? So music does have a space for, soothing, right? And we go to it, right? Humming for ourselves or rocking to something that no one else is listening to, in order to get us through a day. There's so many different things that persons of color, namely Black and African Americans, use. And Rachel's like, I can get a witness, right? I understood exactly what that meant, Rachel. So I think that's important for us to recognize. So thank you all for your comments. And like I said, I didn't miss out on a thing that was shared, because I think every element you noted gives more fodder to what I'm talking about in terms of students that are in pain to get a degree.
Can I ask one more question from Dr. Michelle Renigan? She is interested, as the limited time that we have here, she's interested in freedom in space and freedom to explore identity. So within freedom, how we address the thing within freedom, how it aligns within liberation and also celebration. In America, freedom is polarized and also politicized. So what are the panelists' thoughts about the spin on freedom and how this harms students, especially students of color?
Yeah, I think that just even with that statement, freedom is polarized and politicized. I think sometimes, even in academia, um, the art of speaking up with being, for myself, being a Black man, and speaking up, it's like, okay, well, this particular professor may not necessarily favor me, right? And these are just thoughts that might go through my mind. And about, okay, the politics of higher ed, right? My professor is white and I'm a Black person. There's politics there. The person, excuse me, might not necessarily like what I'm saying in a particular moment or space and time, and might delay my grade. I don't know. You know, these are just politics that might go through my mind, which I'm sure goes through several other students of color. But I think freedom to speak, freedom to choose, freedom to say what is and stand up for what is right, or simply what you believe in. There's a cost to speaking up, but then there's also a cost to not speaking up. And for me, when I would speak up, it was more so not necessarily concerned about what would be the outcome for myself, but thinking about other students, other Black men who will come into the program, other Black women who will come into the program, and other students of color who may be Asian or Pacific Islander, or I won't go down the list, but I think it was very important for me to use the freedom that I have in academia to speak up for what needed to be said, for the sake of the students that would come after me, because there was just this feeling of like, well, if I don't say anything, then maybe we all might walk away thinking that what happened or what transpired was okay. And there's no way that I, as an individual, could sit and not say something, or try to do something about it. So I think that's the art of freedom, but I think there's a cost to both not speaking up and also speaking up.
Thank you, Alwayne. Dr. Michelle Rangan said that was very real and raw. And I just want to acknowledge that. Thank you so much. That takes a lot of courage to say that. Dr. Norris, would you like to respond to the question?
You know, it's all of what Alwayne said, and I think that on the other end of that, as educators, we really need to consider, you know, what are the things in our settings, in our environments, our classroom environments, within our department, within our college and university, that that limits or has these negative consequences that reduces people's needs to step forward and access that freedom. And so I think that that's a important discussion that we have to have about you know, just how what are we doing in these spaces that creates an environment that is inherently hostile and violent to people that are minoritized when we think about continuums of harm, and then what must we do to reduce that harm and allow people to access freedom.
Thank you. I know we have to wrap up, unfortunately, and of course these conversations could go on. I wish could go on for many hours, but we have to wrap up. I really just want to end by saying, in the spirit of Sankofa, we honor thy past and we learn to pave it forward. And I just want to acknowledge that to let our roles be reaching one and teaching one towards success, access, and creating equity within the classroom and beyond. And know it's our duty to be the foot soldiers, like Dr. Carey said, to pave it forward to build a better future. But I want to thank you both for courageously sharing your story and taking the time to be here this evening. And also thank you, Dr. Carey, and also to Darren, Dustin, and also the staff for supporting this event. Thank you to the audience for joining us today, and I hope you all have a safe and a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all. It was phenomenal. Thank you so much for sharing of yourselves.